Okay, the session is now being recorded. Welcome once again, everyone, to another synchronous session of SOCSI 100, and this is for week 10. So we are now in the 10th week. Um, what we're going to do today is to try and fast forward things a bit. As I've mentioned, I have no really, I really have no strict intentions of being able to follow the outline that we had. That for me serves as a guide. It would be good if we could stick to it, but it's also good to a great extent if we don't, because that means that we're focusing more on certain topics. Today, the title of the lecture, the title of our topic basically is the foundation of the universities, right, in medieval Europe. And I am trying to link that with the institutionalization of inquiry, right? Which is, if you try and recall the past, 6 or 7 or how many weeks that we've been discussing the history of the sciences and the social sciences, we are always talking about the history of inquiry, the history of how questions transform not only the intellectual landscape of a certain culture, of a certain civilization, but uh, how certain questions are reflective or manifestations of the status quo or the world order, the current world order. So the history of inquiry also is reflective of a very important aspect of the history of the world and the history of ideas. And that has been our focus so far. So it makes sense, as I've mentioned to you before at the start of the semester. um, I've been thinking about what to do for the medieval part, because as you know very well, there are non-negotiable parts of the syllabus that we have to discuss. So it has to have an ancient period, a medieval period, and a modern period. And it's difficult to choose something for the medieval period because by and large it's a very theoretical oriented period, no, for lack of a better term. For those of you who are taking, or for those of you who are familiar with medieval philosophy or are probably taking the course at the moment, you would know that the questions that they try to pursue are not so much always directly social, political, cultural, right? They have those things, but it's a very difficult thing to extract without having, without going too deep into the heart of the matter. Um, that's because primarily medieval philosophers are dealing with issues on metaphysics and epistemology, psychology, of course. The classical study of psychology is the study of the soul, of psyche. Um, so what I went for, as I did last time, was to talk about the foundation of a very important institution, a very important, maybe a landmark contribution of the Middle Ages, which sort of paved the way or established the ground for the institutionalization of inquiry. Prior to this, inquiry was pursued by scholars, independent of any institution. No, sometimes at the request of certain powers that be, sometimes in order to appeal to certain powers, right? Um, there's a recurring theme in the history of inquiry. You have scholars who would challenge authority, but at the same time make it so that they are appealing to them. We saw, we learned that Copernicus did that. Later on, even modern philosophers like Rene Descartes and Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, would um, you know Descartes in trying to appeal to authority, even though as a French wrote in Latin, and Kant was very critical of the Prussian Empire, Prussian state, but to always sign his correspondences with the king or with the emperor with your most humble servant. So there's always this dual tension or maybe dual character of those who are trying to be critical of the authority, but at the same time trying to appeal to it. Okay, so before the university, there wasn't any institution that housed inquiry. It was conducted independently, and as such, as I was telling you, they try to attach themselves to certain powers that be. Okay, so before we talk about that, I want to talk about an important thing, no, because the last uh, the last sort of topic that we discussed was about myth, no, and it would be quite difficult to we discussed this briefly, and we touched on this topic briefly, the transition from myth to natural philosophy or physics or naturals or science. But I want you to be able to understand that, and this is the point of the um, Robert Segal or whatever reading, no, that there's no definitive transition, no, not unless we are going to talk about specific variants of myth, because there are inevitably myths that still exist to this day. But of course, these myths have taken the form of ideology. Like the myth of the American dream is always this, neoliberal or Western hegemony, or the ideology of Western hegemony of the grass is greener in the West and things of that sort. So we have to be clear cut when we talk about what transition are we talking about. And the transition that appears to be more evident, appears to be more obvious, as in the case of ancient Greece, is the transition from cosmocentric explanations of reality, right? Explanations of reality that are centered on the origin of the universe, the origin of the surrounding. No. So when we talk about that, the thing that we have to understand is that ancient Greeks primarily relied on the authority of the poets, right? That's the whole basis for myth, and that's the reason why when you talk about the ancient Greek word for myth, muthos, no, or if you know a little bit, sorry, if you know Greek and would like to read even Iliad or Odyssey of Homer in Greek, you will find um, this you will find this like recurrence of the theme of mutos eipe, or he said or she said, right? um Chiara Bottici also discussed that he said or she said kind of thing is like a poetry within a poetry, right? As you know very well, both the Iliad and the Odyssey is already like epics in themselves. They are very, very long um, um, poems, right? But it's also a performed poetry. Now, it's not, meant as something that is written then published. It was meant as a performance, right? So a lot of what goes on in that performative aspect of the poetry is this he said and she said thing. And that's where the myth comes in, right? Myth was originally a story, something that he or she said. Now, what's the problem with that, right? Why was there a transition? Because if we accept that there is a transition, there must have been a problem, right? Something must have been inherently limited. Like something must have been inherent, or we people must have found out the inherent deficiency of that he said and she said thing. And if we think about it, like if we reflect on the problem of that sort of thing, and I ask that you reflect on it because it also tries to place you in the shoes, as it were, of the Milesians, or the first philosophers from Miletus. No, what seems to be the problem with that he said or she said? Kung ilalagay natin yung sarili natin sa kanila, halimbawa sa konteksto natin ngayon, right? Hindi ba't nagiging problematic rin sa atin if we are being, if we are being the recipients of important pieces of information that supposedly have, huge consequences to our lives, and the entire weight of that information is anchored on something that is he said or she said. Do you get my point? Like, it becomes problematic. Diba? It becomes problematic. Kaya nagkakaroon ng transition. And again, the emphasis is on a transition, not really a very radical break, because that sort of break happened over time, right? As I was telling you before, Plato was very critical of poets, but at the same time, he would also use something like allegories to explain his philosophy. So that sort of break happened over time, and what we have to understand there is that there was a transition because there was a problem in explaining reality through the weight of he said slash she said. They simply, at the time, the Milesians couldn't simply accept that. No, kahit naman tayo eh. If we are in that sort of position today, right? I'm sure some of you are very active in maybe the current social and political campaigns that are happening. You might be doing your part whether in the streets, in the social media platforms, or wherever. And I'm sure many of you will be frustrated when you are being, you are being sent information, especially questionable pieces of information that are anchored on merely he said or she said. Right? That's the whole problem of natural philosophy. That's the reason why philosophy gradually emerged. Okay. So let me share with you a few notes on that particular aspect, and we'll do that first, maybe for a couple of minutes. Then we proceed with the medieval stuff. Okay. So again, our your backdrop is what? Your backdrop is an intellectual culture of ancient Greece that bows down to the authority of the poets, right? So kahit yung mismong poets, this is what I'm telling you earlier, it's the poets themselves. The poets themselves are the ones using the he said or she said. But over time, the poets became an authority that even though they are the ones saying he said or she said, right? Even though they are the ones saying that, even though they are the ones saying that he said or she said, they became so authoritative that people believe them. Okay, but it is important to note that after some time, not all of ancient Greece was very receptive to that kind of authority. Okay, they simply couldn't be all of them couldn't simply be that receptive. So the 6th century BCE was a turning point for the intellectual culture of ancient Greece, because for the very first time, a significant challenge was mounted against the prevalent beliefs. Okay, and this is where again you find Segal useful here, because he also explains how myths became a significant aspect of religion. Okay, so if we are going to talk about the birth of Western philosophy, and then of course philosophy is the origin of social sciences. It is the root. Kumbaga, kung titingnan natin yung yung Adam and Eve, as it were, ng social sciences. We find it in philosophy, right? So the birth of Western philosophy is not something that occurred out of a vacuum. It occurred at a transitional period. Okay, it featured the abandonment, and I'm quoting here from William Keith Chambers Guthrie, who was a historian of Greek, ancient Greece and Greek philosophy. And he's saying here, the abandonment, the period featured the abandonment at the level of conscious thought of the mythological solutions to problems concerning the origin and nature of the universe and the processes that go on with it. Right? It is the conscious abandonment, okay? The conscious abandonment of thought based on mythology. Ano ibig sabihin ng conscious abandonment? They are aware that something is wrong with that kind of explanation. They're aware na parang merong kulang sa he said, she said ng muthos eipe. Parang merong malaking pagkukulang. And as such, we cannot rely on that, right? Imagine having the four seasons explained to you by saying that, he said or she said that the reason why there are four seasons is because of Persephone, because of Hades, etc., and so on. The whole arrangement wherein, at times she would be in the underworld, at times she would be above, and so on. That just simply did not fly with some of the ancient Greeks by the turn of the 6th century BCE. So Guthrie is saying as well, for religious faith, right? There is substituted a new kind of faith, right? And you don't get confused with this, because he was saying on the one hand there is a religious faith which is by and large in terms of mythology is a blind faith, right? But that sort of faith is substituted with a new kind of faith, a new kind of belief, a new kind of trust. Okay. And this sort of trust remained the basis of scientific thought. What kind of faith or belief or trust was that? That sort of new faith, new belief, new trust is that, and here he says, the visible world conceals a rational and intelligible order, right? The world presents to you as something rational, meaning can be understood by reason. It has an intelligible order, meaning it can be understood, right? Understanding based on reason. And that the causes of the natural world are to be sought within its boundaries. You seek natural explanations from the natural world. This is not any ancient Greek philosopher speaking. This is a historian describing the thinking of ancient Greek philosophers. And you have to take note of this because later on, when we talk about Galileo, in Renaissance, this would be the same argument that Galileo was making. This would be the same argument that Galileo not was, but would be making, right? That the explanations of the natural world cannot be controlled by theology, right? That's why later on there would be, we would call this later on the demarcation of the sciences. Sciences would try and set up its borders, its boundaries. Okay, but we'll talk about that in a few weeks' time. For now, the thinking of the ancient Greeks is that, again, quoting from Guthrie, the causes of the natural world are to be sought within its boundaries. And the autonomous human reason, okay, this is a loaded term, autonomous human reason. Remember, autonomous is a Greek term meaning self-governing, right? Autonomous, English autonomy or autonomous. That means self-governing human reason. What does that mean? When you have a self-governing human reason, you dictate your own reason. There are no external influences that would massage or bend or manipulate your reason, right? And if you look at religion, that is what happens most of the time. You are controlled in order to be able to be a follower, right? There is a reason why we are called, and this is in the Christian context, it is common to call the followers sheep, right? And God is the shepherd. There's a reason for that, because we are expected, or people who are part of that religion are expected to follow. But when uh when the ancient Greeks were trying to liberate themselves from myth, right, they were sort of arguing from an autonomous human reason. The world is rational, the world can be understood. We have human reason, we have the capability to think. It must be used in order to understand the world. Not he said or she said, but your very own thinking. In other words, pag hinarap mo yung mundo, what do you think about it? Without the he said or she said. What do you think about it? Okay? That should be, human reason should be the sole and sufficient instrument for that particular search. Okay? So, against the reality, against the idea that our reality can be explained by resorting to stories, no? There came some thinkers who thought that explanations about reality should be natural, okay, as opposed to mythological, right? So the birth of Western philosophy, and these first thinkers who thought that the explanations about the world should be natural are, the first philosophers. They didn't form a group and call themselves as such. That was a later on categorization by some historian. But we know that they are the first philosophers, and the birth of Western philosophy took place in the city of Miletus, which is an Ionian Greek city that is now in the territory of Turkey. Okay. So in ancient Greece, you have four main tribes, as it were. You have the Dorians, the Aeolians, Achaeans, and the Ionians. So our what we have to understand is what are the historical conditions that paved the way for the transition from myth to natural philosophy. That's what we hinted before at the lecture, right? Now we're going to talk about the specific stuff, right? What led to the birth of Western philosophy? One thing that we have to understand, and this is again where Guthrie is very helpful, is that if we look at the historical location of Miletus, it was a very powerful economic city. No, it wouldn't be far fetched to say that it was like Singapore or present day Singapore. It was a harbor city, and as such, it's functioned greatly as a trading center. It imported and exported goods, and because it is an economic center, it allowed Milesians to establish connections with other cultures and civilizations. Diba? Um, Students would not students, but um what do you call this, the tradesmen, no, tradespeople who will be importing goods and so on, or exporting goods, no, will always be going through that particular place. Okay, so it is a wealthy country, no doubt about that, and many of its upper class citizens, I'm quoting here again from Guthrie, lived in the atmosphere of luxury and culture, which may be broadly described as humanistic and materialistic in tendency. Not humanistic as in the humanism that we are going to talk about much later on, but humanistic as in man-centered. So later on, magkakaroon din ng transition from cosmocentric to anthropocentric, man-centered. No? Humanism and materialistic in tendency. Its high standard of living, and this is the important part, was too obviously the product of human energy, resource, and initiative for it to acknowledge any debt to the gods. No? it couldn't simply uh, what do you call this? It couldn't simply suggest that their success. They couldn't simply suggest that their success was the result of the intervention of any god or whatsoever. Nakita nila na kapag nakakapag-produce sila ng good products that they could export, it is because they had good farmers. They weren't thanking gods or goddesses for a good harvest. It is because they had good farmers. You know, if they're able to export lots of fish, for example, it's because they had good fishermen, and they wouldn't they had good hardworking fishermen. They wouldn't give that sort of credit to Poseidon. Okay, so the early philosophers, right, in this particular town, and again they didn't call themselves philosophers, but they were simply thinkers, right? They look outward to the world of nature and match his human wits with its secrets. Again, that's from Guthrie. They looked outward to the world of nature and match his human wits against its secrets. Okay? Kaya nga yung phrasing ni Guthrie kanina, the world conceals a rational order. Of course, pag tinignan natin, hindi naman obvious, no? Bakit merong waves? Why is the sky blue? Why is the sun following sorry, why is the moon following me? Why is there a moon in the evening and a sun in the morning? Why is it that there are some months in the year that the sun rises very late? Why is it that there are some months in the year that the sun the sun sets at a very late time? Okay, so the intellectual culture, and again, to say that these are literary and philosophical cultures is an anachronistic term, no? But the intellectual culture at the time presented a very strong materialistic or naturalistic inclination, born out of a secular orientation, without recurrence to gods, without reference to gods. The gods are there; it's part of the ancient Greek culture, but they were at the background. No, because for them, anthropomorphic deities and divine intervention did not make sense. If you have deities, they had to be perfect. They couldn't understand why deities are anthropomorphic or have the character of human beings. Okay. So in a sense, there was a great freedom of thought. The thinking was not due to divine guidance and for the sake of appealing to deities. Inquiry in this sense was disinterested, right? And because it was disinterested, it could have only come from wonder or curiosity. And we discussed this before. Plato and Aristotle were thus right to suggest that philosophy begins with wonder. Okay, so it was disinterested in the sense that it was born out of pure curiosity. We do not need to explain the world in order to have knowledge about gods. It was just a want to explain the world. Okay, so the early philosophers of Miletus were called naturalists or natural philosophers. Again, because they wanted to explain the world in a natural way as opposed to a mythological way. Okay, natural philosophy will later on, or was the ancient name of physics. Okay, so the first, and this is where was it Redfield or the other reading will be very helpful if you have read that, because it discusses the Milesians. No? So here you have Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, and they all believe their common argument is that the world is reducible to an ultimate stuff, right? Uh, If you want, you can call it a foundation, a foundational principle, which is an arche, an origin, no, or a fundamental element. So Thales believed it was water, right? And according to Aristotle, because Aristotle also documents this, Thales says, again quoting from Aristotle, the principle is water, getting the notion perhaps from seeing that the nutriment of all things is moist, no, moist, and that heat itself is generated from the moist and kept alive by it. He got this notion from this fact and from the fact that the seeds of all things have a moist nature, and that water is the origin of the nature of moist things. Okay, so Thales was of course, scientifically speaking, Thales is highly inaccurate. But what makes it radical is that for the very first time, we looked into a natural explanation of the world. Okay. Again, if we're going to dive deep, if you're going to dive deep into this kind of scholarship, if this would interest you in any way, there are always going to be some debates here because I think the most compelling argument is that if you look into Greek mythology, like the genealogy of Greek mythology, Hesiod, who wrote the theogony, no, the genealogy of gods, provided natural names, no. So you have chaos, you have Gaia, you have Kronos, and these are all natural, natural uh, names or natural concepts, right? But and so they were saying it's not that myth was not natural. As a matter of fact, it was. It just spoke in a different language. No, so there's that one camp. But on the other hand, some scholars will also be saying it's the other way around. The reason why we have, the word, or the reason why we um, understand time as chronos or chaos, or earth as Gaia, is because we took it from that sort of myth. We took it from that sort of mythological accounts. Okay, so we're no longer going to discuss this because it is in the reading that I've provided you, but that sort of wraps up that transition that you know we have discussed last time, right? This is the reason why there is a transition, and I wanted to discuss this first because there's going to be a similar transition later on when we reach the Renaissance, which means to say that a certain language or prevalence of authority will take place, in the medieval period. Okay. Um, are there any questions at this point before I continue? Any questions? Anything that do you think is perhaps unclear or needs clarification at this point? Questions, thoughts, insights? Sure. Everything clear so far? Okay. For how about the others? Are you still following me or okay? All right. So sige, let's continue. Okay, so the reading focused on the foundation of the medieval university, and to a great extent, there's a lot going on in the medieval, um, in the medieval landscape that it would be difficult to understand context that would that would give rise to the foundation of that institution without much knowledge of the prevailing social and political undercurrents that took place. And this is where the reading, I think, was very helpful. If you have had the chance to read it, Edward Grant is very clear in his exposition. There are some historical details there that are, I think, should be up for debate. I don't think it's definitive, as is with all historical accounts. So it would always be good to um, counter examine some of these claims against the backdrop of other claims, against the backdrop of other historical accounts. But nonetheless, one of the main reasons why I chose that reading is because that sort of reading gives you a very nice overview, a short and nice overview of the foundation of the university. Okay, so let's continue with the medieval period, and I suppose one of the like one interesting way to begin our discussion um of this medieval period and the history of inquiry in medieval period is to ask, how did a learned person, you know, look at the world in the Middle Ages? I wouldn't say educated person, because educated always has this connotation of being educated in an institution, no? But whereas you have, a learned person, and that learned person could be self-taught. It could be, or he or she could be an autodidact. So, how did a learned person look at the world in the Middle Ages? Okay, I have here some quotations from a history text, and it says, when an educated observer around 1300 went around on a cloudless night and peered into the sky, he may have marveled at the vast expanse of the star-spangled firmament, and, awestruck, praised the Lord as the creator of the universe. But he would not have been confused. What he saw was not bewildering chaos, but order that made sense. That's a general thematic of medieval way of thinking, right? It's a very dense and compact description, not direct description, but a very convincing image of the medieval framework. Okay, because of course, a lot happened in between the fall of the Hellenic Empire all the way to the emergence of the Middle Ages. And what's the thing um that most notably took place? Of course, the emergence of the Christian Empire. Okay, the emergence of competing religions, the dominance of some religions, and so on. Okay, so we are now fast forwarding our discussion to the 1300s. Um, and you have here a person who would be at awe at, you know the stars in the sky, similar to how an ancient Greek natural philosopher or an ancient Greek poet, would have been at awe in what she would see or he would see. But whereas the poet would attribute this, to, creation of the gods and goddesses, the natural philosopher would look at it from a more natural perspective, right? Then came the Middle Ages, which occurred at the height of the expansion of the Christian religion. You have learned people, intellectuals, who would look up the sky and be amused or be amazed, but they would know that this beauty that they are seeing, despite being understandable, despite it being a rational order that made sense, was nevertheless created by God. Okay. So at this point in history, we have come a long way from using myths and stories to explain reality, all the way to the earliest attempts to explain our universe naturally. Ancient Greek philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle had their conceptions of God, both of which point to some highest, transcendent, and most divine being. Like they didn't speak of God using the term God, but they spoke of a highest, transcendent, and most divine being. Okay. So, you know, just so that you don't get confused, we are not proceeding in a very linear way. And I think that's quite a strategic thing to do. So we began with Copernicus, then we went on with myths, and then the transition to natural philosophy. Now we're trying to go back to Copernicus, except this time in a much more detailed and slower way. That this is the entire content of part two, right? We have to talk about uh, the very foundations of modern science, and we could start in the medieval period. So, in the medieval period, no, the knowledge of reality was already largely shaped by the predominance of Aristotelian physics. And again, if you follow the discussion on why there was or why Copernicus was revolutionary, right? If you understood that, and I think some of you did very well in your essay in explaining that, it was because he shifted the framework of thinking. Pre-modern science, by pre-modern, that includes medieval, right? Pre-modern science, the framework of pre-modern science is built on authority, in as much as the framework of Greek mythology is built on authority, right? The framework of medieval science is built on authority. And Copernicus was precisely revolutionary because from authority, he shifted the framework towards a more natural outlook. A look that, again, to use the description of Guthrie for ancient Greeks, that is anchored on the autonomy of human reason. And that included the capacity or the capability to conduct studies, experimentations, and challenge authorities. But medieval philosophy or medieval thinking was very much influenced or was very much operating against the backdrop of authority. And that is why Aristotle is still being studied in medieval period. That's because Aristotle, had the status of being an authoritative figure. Okay, so it will not be misleading to suggest that both science and philosophy developed in the Middle Ages. Again, if you're interested in the specific contributions of medieval ages to science, because there's always this connotation that it's the dark ages or something, which is true. To some extent it is true, but as a general representative or characteristic of the time, it is very much a derogatory, misleading term. There are huge advancements that occurred during this period. No, it's just that they have been overshadowed by the more prevalent general framework in which many medieval thinkers operated. Okay, so both science and philosophy developed, but not the sort of development that took place in radical breaks. So you have here a sort of like um a cartography, or what do you call this, like uh a sort of a map of the universe, of the solar system, if you want to put it that way. But of course they refer to it as the universe back then because they didn't have a fixed conception of whether there are systems outside it. So they thought that this was it. The ones that we could see, that's that's the limit of it, right? So you have here Chelum, Imperium, Habitaculum Dei, right? The Empire of Celestial, Heavenly Empire of God, Heavenly Empire, Home of God, no, something like that. Chelum Imperium Habitaculum Dei. Yeah, it. Well, I'm not going to read it anymore. But you have here a very sort of outline or map or a plan of the structure and order of the universe. So when they speak of order in this sense, they're speaking also very much of a literal order, an order that you can understand. Okay. So we note that one of the theological like positions in defense of the geocentric model was that we hold our you know place at the center of the universe in very very special terms. So you have here in the middle earth. um yeah, you have here in the middle earth. This is not the sun. Okay, so you have the earth, Luna is the moon, Mercury, Veneris, Solis is the sun, Martis, Jovis is Jupiter, Saturni, and then you have the stars, the firmament, no, firmamento. um that's the sort of the uh order in which they thought the world is, or the universe is. Sorry. So it is unsurprising for us to know that the observer would think of himself as being in the middle of things. Right? The earth on which he lived was the immovable center of the universe. Around it, there moved in concentric order, 10 transparent convex spaces or spheres, beginning with those of the 7 known planets. Okay, so at this point, there are only 7 known planets, in which they also considered the sun and the moon as planetary bodies, celestial bodies. Okay, beyond the sphere of the last planet, Saturn, is that of the fixed stars. Okay, the firmament of fixed stars, stellatum. Okay, so the idea was that because it is, or we are the ones observing, we must be at the center because we could see everything. Right? The sort of reductive explanation can be framed in that way. So medieval astrology, magic, and science. Astrology in the Middle Ages was regarded as a very important source of knowledge about human life. And you would think, how was this possible kung nagkaroon na ng break from myth to natural philosophy? Yes, there was. But again, because of the development of religion, no, na-halt yung break. Nag-stop yung break. Nag-stop yung transition na yun. In other words, we weren't able to capitalize on that transition because religion occurred. No, religion again imposed faith on certain things. Okay, so historians suggest that medieval scholars regarded the planets as animate, often as intelligent bodies which influence life on Earth. The reason why they could move is because they are intelligent, and by intelligent I mean they have. And again, this is where medieval complexity gets in. They have anima intellectiva. They have intellective soul, right? And again, if you dive deep into the heart of these medieval topics, then you get to address questions about whether the soul is united to the celestial body. And if it's not, is it the same with the human body? Is the soul united in the body? That's is a great, like, That's the reason why I'm very careful about the use of the term Dark Ages, because if you really dive deep into the heart of medieval philosophy or medieval thinking, you'd find that they have a lot of significant contributions that are otherwise often overlooked, right? Um, so for example, like one of the things I've recently discovered is that the medieval philosophers were actually the first to provide epistemological metaphysical arguments from physiological sources, right? They're able to provide how they're able to explain how thinking happens based on the structure of the brain. And that's a very unique thing that, we think of as so novel today in the fields of cognitive sciences or cognitive psychology. Okay? But anyway, so as opposed to astrology in antiquity, medieval astrology was already tempered. Okay, again, that's the shtick, so to speak, no, of the church. It will accommodate whatever it can, so long as it does not contradict with doctrines, right? So, uh, medieval astrology was tempered so as not to contrast with Christian orthodoxy, and as such, practices such as reading the future, no, um, reading the future based on the stars or worshiping the heavenly bodies, as is the thing with classical astrology. These things were forbidden in medieval astrology. But it was also believed that the planets, again, I'm quoting here, had an influence on the formation of metals and on people's physical and mental state, right? So, medieval astrology, magic, and science, again, this is a very important consideration in terms of inquiry, because it's not, although there was the university, that was a very late medieval creation, right? It isn't, the university culture is not something that was prevalent during the span of the Middle Ages. You know, it was isolated in some areas, and as such, these areas are treated like economic centers. But at the same time, there are also some prevalent cultures that we may think of as something that is backward, considering the time. And dito pumapasok yung medieval astrology and magic and science. Okay. So astrologers believe that the movements of the stars influence numerous things on Earth, from the weather and the growth of crops to the personalities of newborn babies and the inner workings of the human body. That became prevalent. But if you look at some parts of Europe where university culture was prevalent, this would not make sense, because there are already those who would be studying the natural philosophy of Aristotle. Okay, so an example of this, ridiculousness would be, but that by the end of the 1500s, physicians across Europe were required by law. Imagine that, by law, to calculate the position of the moon before carrying out complicated medical procedures such as surgery or bleeding, because otherwise there would be, complications in terms of the physiology of the person. I think I showed you this map before, if I'm not mistaken. I showed you this map before, and we were talking about this map as an example of a medieval map, the Mappa Mundi. And as I was telling you before, this is not a very, geographically accurate sort of map. I mean, you cannot use this and navigate the seas. You would get lost. But this is also a map that represents power, right? It represents the centrality of the Christian faith. That's why you have Jerusalem as the the geometric center, right? And because of this sort of European centrism, that was happening, all the other continents that are yet to be colonized or explored are deemed uninhabitable. Okay. So again, going back to the question, how did the learned person look at the world in the Middle Ages as opposed to what we may expect out of maps today? Based on our knowledge of geography, these medieval world maps were not necessarily made for traveling or for pointing at exact locations. Okay. So they were intentionally symbolical representations, not just of earthly geography, based on the, again, perceptions of power, but also based on essential historical events. Okay. So you have, for instance, the scene of the final judgment on top. Again, if we, I think I can zoom it in here, right? See that this is the scene of the final judgment. Okay. So the map depicts also the exodus of Jews from Egypt. So it's a very historical map. It's not a geographically accurate map, and as such that it is a historical map. Uh, it was a map that depicted power. Okay. Um, the creation, or not the creation, but the discovery of the more geographically accurate maps came on the scene with the rediscovery of Ptolemy's work, no, titled Geography. So for the very first time, and this is an important contribution from Ptolemy. Here you have the incorporation of the degrees of latitude and longitude, and it shows that how the curved, the spherical surface, or the spherical shape of the Earth can be reproduced in a flat depiction. Because they didn't have globes at this point, they needed maps, and the question was, how do you present something spherical in a flat surface, which is a map. Okay, so again, maybe to zoom in. Yan. So a brief description of the habit the orbis habitabius, no. And here you have, again, you can see the familiar grid lines here, which is already common in contemporary maps. This was something that Copernicus brought to the scene. Okay. So a perspective on a medieval perspective on man's place in the world. An educated medieval person would believe that the human being and the universe are connected. Again, a learned person, a learned slash educated person, but not educated as in institutionally educated. Okay. So the medieval person believes that the universe is reflected on the human being in a microcosmic scale. And this was a similar argument to the one that Plato was advancing in his philosophy, wherein he says that the state is an individual writ large. Okay, the state is an individual that is structured at large. Okay, so again, despite the birth of natural philosophy in ancient Greece, there was this return to certain backward explanations of naturality. Halimbawa, the human body, they thought, was made up of the same four elements of fire, air, earth, water. And we detect that on the earth as hot, cold, dry, and wet. So from a cosmological standpoint, the combination of the four fundamental qualities form the four elements of water. An example of that is that in the body of the human being, the combination of these four qualities form the four primary bodily fluids. Hot and wet, the combination of hot and wet leads to blood. No, the combination of hot and dry is yellow bile. No, choler or choleric. Cold plus wet equals phlegm. Cold plus dry equals black bile or melancholia. So the specific mixture of the fluids became essential to understanding the composition of a human being. And the composition of the human being points out to the temperament or the complexion, no, of a human being. Not complexion as in skin color, but complexion as temperament. Okay. So it tells us not only the physical state of a person, but also their character. Okay. So again, according to medieval people, the human body was not just a bag of bones and intestines, spiced spiced with the temperament of bodily fluids and provided with a network of veins, arteries, and nerves for the transport of all vital physical and mental functions to all parts of the body in the form of volatiles, no, called spiritus. So the body was also the seat of an immaterial, immortal component called the soul. The Latin term for the soul is anima, which for human beings harbored three essential abilities. And this is something that's not new to medieval thinking. This was Aristotle. This was Plato. So the soul has the ability to feed the body. It has the ability to have sensory perception, and the unique quality in which humans were different from other living beings, animals, and plants, the capacity for reason, activated through divine enlightenment, or put more simply, through the intervention of the Holy Ghost. Again, it sounds very religiously language. No, you might think of it as that, but it's a very complex medieval argument. I'm not sure whether some of you are philo minors here taking medieval philosophy, but if you happen to have a discussion on this is a very important aspect of medieval thinking, because uh, they don't speak of the soul as the way we speak it today, as something very spiritual. No, soul as kaluluwa. This is soul as psyche, and psyche is mind. Kaya I was telling you a while ago, psychology is the study of the soul, right? In its original context, psyche is mind slash soul, because they didn't have they know that the brain is an organ. Okay, to put it simply, no, they knew that the brain was an organ of the body. In the in at some point in the medieval period, before they could explain thinking in physiological terms, the one that I'm telling you a while ago, they thought that thinking was a capacity of the soul, not of the brain, but of the soul. So thinking does not happen in the brain. Again, that's another issue. No, is thinking unique is thinking necessary for human beings? No. So you have the soul, you have your anima, you have again, I mentioned a while ago, the anima intellectiva, and that is what distinguishes us from other beings, because plants only have vegetative soul, nutritive soul. Ito yung ability to feed the body. That's the only thing plants could do, according to Aristotle. And then you have the sensitive soul, no, sensory perception, and the unique quality. Sensory perception, okay, the capacity to be passionate, the capacity to feel, okay, basically. And that's something that is also part of the that's something that is part of the soul uh, of animals. Okay, so you have the vegetative soul of the plants, you have the vegetative and sensitive soul of the animals, and you have a third for the human beings, and that's the anima intellectiva, the intellective soul. Okay, and that has the capacity for reason, and the key word there is activate, because thinking, no, is not, and this is the complexity of medieval arguments, is not, it's unique to human beings. It is not, it is not always necessary for human beings. because thinking happens. Thinking is a process. Thinking is happens when it is activated. Okay. And of course, there are a lot of things going on here. You have the doctrine of participation and so on. That's why you have participation through the activation of through divine enlightenment, right? We participate in the thinking, nous, of the divine, right? So thinking is a process. Anyway, those are very again very complicated, complex arguments. There are a lot of debates within that in the medieval context, but suffice it to say that's how they think of the human body. The human is the seat, the human body is the seat of the anima intellectiva. And again, that's a very this is a very huge topic, you know? Because when you talk about an immaterial stuff, an immaterial soul, how do you reconcile that with, Bible, the catechism, the teaching of the church that, sinners have their souls burned in hell? How is that possible? How is it possible that something immaterial burns through a material fire? Again, that's another medieval question. No, is the soul united to the human body? That's another problem. But anyway, um, so historians, because of the like the prevalence of that diverse, educated or learned view, no, historians agree that it is more difficult to determine how those who did not have the privilege of education thought. How did they think? Because on the one hand, you have this privilege of being able to be educated, but not in an institution. Then you have self-taught thinkers, or those who have the necessary fortune to buy books, to buy copies of books, which was very rare at the time. Um, so as I've already been explicitly saying, this is a very general worldview. What we've been discussing is a very general worldview, known to learned or educated people, but it is also a very simplified version of what the intellectual elite has been studying. So you have the learned and educated people, and they might be the ones who are either self-taught or going to institutions. But on the other hand, there are also, those who are a bit more elite in terms of sources, and they would be the ones who are or they would be the ones who can afford to travel and journey with certain masters, and we will get to that later on. Okay, so here's an important thing: what we define today as the medieval worldview, okay, is significantly Greek in origins, and this is where, what I've been telling you, the importance of authority comes in, because it is the medieval way of thinking is by and large shaped by five important thinkers that they have regarded as authority. That is why the function of medieval thinking was not to produce new thoughts. The function of medieval thinking was not to discover new things. The function of medieval thinking is to master authority, is to master the previous knowledge. It wasn't an issue for them whether, they need to contribute to the edifice of knowledge. Medieval thinkers would, again, insofar history is concerned, they could add their commentaries, they could add their opinions, but by and large, these are people who spend their entire lives learning about authority. So five important authoritative thinkers: Plato, Platon, Aristoteles, Euclid, Ptolemy, as we've discussed, and the another important one would be Galen, the physician, and very influential thinker in the field of medicine. Right. Plato's influence in the medieval world was indirect through an Egyptian thinker named Plotinus. So Neoplatonism began with Plotinus. It's so the reason why Plato was still, again, for those of you who are familiar with Plato, maybe in your senior high school or a philosophy course you've taken, Plato was very important for medieval thinkers because Plato's arguments can help provide philosophical support for the Christian belief in God as the sole, transcendent, eternal, and perfectly good creator of the universe, as well as in the immortality of the human soul. Okay, so Plato had this kind of dualistic metaphysics. Put it, he has this idea that the world in which we live in, is a poor copy of of an eternal, perfect world of forms that exists independently of the material world. And so that sort of argument gets appropriated by, again, the key term is appropriation, no? Appropriatio. Another theme in medieval philosophy gets appropriated by medieval thinkers, right? And what they do in appropriating it is to try and reconcile Christian doctrines with that sort of philosophical thinking. Okay, how do they reconcile that? So you have here Augustine, later on Saint Augustine of Hippo, talking about, the city of man and the city of God, that civitate Dei, which was a direct parallel to the material world and the world of forms. Okay. Important caveat: Plato was not explicitly a monotheist, no, but his notion of God as the most perfect being, the first cause, the prime mover, along with Aristotle, because Aristotle has a similar argument such as this, was very attractive to Christian doctrines. And as I was telling you before, that's a huge, like, appropriation is a huge aspect of Christian history. Kaya nga yung pinapaliwanag ko sa inyo noon, the celebration of the birth of Christ on the 25th of December is by and large a product of appropriation. Because again, historically speaking, or if we are to put it in accurate terms, the historical Christ wasn't born on December, probably sometime around March. But the reason why the Christians wanted to appropriate the December celebration is because of the feast of the sun god. Excuse me, Io Saturnalia. It would be very easy to say that no, what you are actually celebrating is the birth of Christ. It would be easy to convert, pagans that way. So they appropriated a lot of things. So whereas Plato was responsible for the philosophical justification of some metaphysical concepts in Christian theology, Aristotle was also responsible for the more practical side. But again, not just the practical side. Aristotle was also very influential in logic, in metaphysics, in natural philosophy, as we will see later on. Now, the strong influence of Aristotle in the Middle Ages, as we've seen, in how the period plays importance in the study of formal logic, which was originally called dialectics, and the empirical study of nature. Again, empirical coming from the Greek word emperia, meaning experience, right? The empirical study of nature here means a study of nature based on experience, on observation, from which he intended to deduce the fundamental laws of nature. Aristotle is often typically regarded as a peripatetic philosopher. And if you had like an understanding of his works on biology, on zoology, you'd find that a lot of his studies on these things are based on his own collections of specimens, whether they be dead animals or samples of plants and so on. So that's like a very direct way of studying these things. Of course, a lot of the things that Aristotle has in his science are quite wrong, especially by today's standards. But we have to give him credit for being the first to have that sort of massive categorization or taxonomization of fields of inquiry. One of the most interesting questions, I suppose, if you haven't picked this up yet, is that what is the connection of Athens to Jerusalem? Right? What is the connection of pagan reason, right, of the ancient Greeks? Because the thinkers that I've cited a while ago, Platon, Aristoteles, Euclid, Ptolemy, and Galen, these are all pagan thinkers. Rational, but pagan. And so one of the questions raised by Tertullian in his work, De Prescriptione Hereticorum, or the prescription of the heretics. That's a huge deal in medieval thinking. A lot of those who go against the church are deemed heretic, but also the excommunication of people, or the declaration of some people as heretics, is also a way of ostracizing people. So it became a sort of weapon. No, if you don't agree with the church, we can call you a heretic, no problem. And then of course that would be a huge threat. It has become a weapon to the point that it became ridiculous. If you know about a bit about history, is the reason why there was a time wherein there was two popes. There was an anti-pope, no, because just all of them started excommunicating each other, because just because they don't agree with each other. Okay, but the main question here of Tertullian, the essence of the question of Tertullian here, is that what indeed has Athens, of course, the locus of that pagan thinking, pagan rational thinking, what has it to do with Jerusalem? Jerusalem, of course, being the geometric center of medieval thinking. Not the geometric center, sorry, the metaphorical center of medieval thinking, the birthplace of Christ. So the medieval way of thinking, and this is important in understanding the university, the medieval university, is best described as the intersection of Athens and Jerusalem, as the intersection of pagan thinking, of pagan rational thinking and faith, or if you want, as the intersection of faith and reason. Okay? So, how were the ancient Greeks able to preserve their legacy in a changing world? Somebody else did it for them. Okay? Why do medieval thinkers, many of whom were primarily theologians, not only associate themselves but also recognize the authority of ancient Greek scholars, who in turn were pagans? Many medieval philosophers justify their reliance on the authority of ancient Greek scholars by arguing that the likes of Plato and Aristotle were monotheists or proto-Christians, Christians before Christ himself. Okay, but this was a view that was held much later on, at high or late Middle Ages. Early Christian thinkers such as Quintus Septimius Florence Tertullianus of the patristic age. Kasi sinabi natin patristic age, this is the age of the church fathers. And later on, you will see that they're also considered as authority. They expressed discomfort at the idea of any such kind of marriage between pagan and Christian philosophy. No? They couldn't see the reason why pagan or rational philosophy had to um, intersect with Christian faith or Christian philosophy. As his famous remark, on the prescription of heretics, what indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What concord is there between the academy and the church? What between heretics and Christians? Logically speaking, there's a huge leap there. You talk about pagan thinkers and as thinkers from Athens, okay. You talk about pagan rational thinkers from the academy, okay. And then you speak of them as heretics. That's a huge leap. No? Title pa lang, that already gives you a sense of what he's talking about. No? The Prescriptione Hereticorum. But the intersection was not always met with distrust, was not always met with, very critical positions. Some were more accommodating. Some thought that by appropriating the language of Greek thinking, of pagan thinking, they are finally, looting or taking the spoils of a conquered enemy. Okay, and taking from the ancient Greeks what can be taken in order to enrich Christian doctrines. If you like if you're, for example, if you're interested in the history of imperialism or nationalism, this is the language of the colonizers. No, we want to civilize the people. We want to, that's the Eurocentric language of colonization. We want to civilize the barbaric people. And this is those who are more accommodating with the marriage of Athens and Jerusalem are sort of taking this sort of argument. We want to be able to take what we can, salvage it, and enrich it. So the downfall of ancient Greeks during the Battle of Corinth in 146 BCE likewise marked the rise of the Roman Empire. And as you probably know from the famous lines of Edgar Allan Poe's To Helen, like the lines read, "To the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome." Greece always had the glory, and Rome's contribution was the grandeur of that. If you understand the distinction between two terms, no, grandeur has to say the least, is more illusory in nature, right? What the greatest contribution of Rome was to expand the glory of Greece and claim it as its own. Okay. So the downfall of ancient Greece marked the end of ancient civilization, along with the city-states and colonies, but it likewise signaled its preservation or immortalization. So the significance of this intersection in the development of inquiry. What is the significance of that intersection? Again, you find here the recurring theme of authority. In Latin, they called it auctoritas. The authority of faith was never questioned. It precisely defined the medieval period. But because they want to justify faith, okay, because they want to, to make faith authoritative, more authoritative than just, blind faith, they needed something to support it. Okay? In an attempt to distance faith from the fate of mythology, from the fate that myth suffered, faith needed the logic, the rigor, the reason of philosophy. So medieval philosophers, it is not enough to believe in God. No, you don't just believe in God, you show the ways of God's existence. Thomas Aquinas had therefore the famous Cinque Vie, the five ways. And he aimed to show the natural um, um, argument for the existence of God. It proceeded logically. There are medieval thinkers who would say that no, that's not possible. The only way by which you could understand God is to first believe in a God. Okay. So during this period, there was a prevalent conviction that every scientific and scholarly endeavor should always be subservient to the effort of better understanding God and his message to humankind as it was laid down the Holy Scripture. Holy Scripture being another form of authority. Okay. Um, of course, here we would have the understanding of Philosophia Ancilia Theologiae, philosophy as the handmaiden of theology. Philosophy had to be used for theology. All right. I'm going to stop here. We have a few minutes left, but I want to entertain your questions if there are any, and we will continue next meeting with that, with auctoritas and the culture of inquiry in medieval university. Because Edward Grant is more or less very charitable in his interpretations. I want to couple that. I want to show it side by side with the more negative implications of auctoritas. No, so yes. Any questions at this point? Was things are things clear so far? Do you have any interests or concerns or insights? Anything that you wish to share? Questions, concerns, insights? Yeah. Are there things that are not clear? Because even if it's a clarificatory question, that would most certainly be welcomed. Nothing? Are you still there?
No question so far, sir.
Okay. Okay. But if at any point something is not clear, you have to be able to ask questions, because that is a sort of my worry when it comes to making sure that you understand what we are, whether in the form of a lecture or student led discussions. I want you to be able to understand where we are going and why we are going in that direction. So even if it is a clarificatory question, it doesn't have to be a groundbreaking theoretical question. It can be as something as, could you repeat what you said or what you meant by this? I would be more than happy to do that. Okay, so please keep that in mind. All right, and see you next meeting. I'll stop the recording for now. Thank you all for attending, and see you all next week.